He was alone, in a room built for applause. The gym air sat heavy in Miami, thick with old sweat and leather that had soaked into the walls over decades. Cassius stood near the heavy bag, hands unwrapped, knuckles still showing faint marks from yesterday's work. His shoulders held steady. His breath moved in controlled rhythm, chest rising and falling with the discipline of someone who learned early that everything visible could be judged. Outside the door, voices pressed against wood and glass. Reporters gathering. Cameras being positioned. Questions already forming in mouths that wouldn't wait for permission to ask them. Inside, the silence wrapped around him differently than it used to. It no longer felt like the quiet before preparation. It felt like the held breath before a verdict gets read aloud. Morning light cut through high windows and hard lines. Cassius watched dust drift through the beams, particles moving without awareness of being observed. His hands flexed once, then went still. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang. Footsteps approached, then passed. The world continued around him, and he stood at its center, fixed by the weight of attention he'd demanded and received. The shift had come gradually, then, all at once. In Miami, the crowds still cheered when he entered arenas. They fed on his predictions, his certainty, the way he turned pre-fight press conferences into performances that newspapers quoted 4 days afterward. But in New York, something sharper lived beneath the applause. The same words that drew laughter in one city prompted silence in another. Faces in the crowd watched with different eyes. Columnists who'd once found him refreshing now used words like brash, arrogant, disrespectful. The change registered in small ways first. A sports writer who used to grin during interviews now kept his expression neutral. A photographer who used to call him champ switched to calling him kid. The boxing press, those men who filled notebooks with observations that would become next morning's truth, had stopped smiling when he predicted outcomes. Their pens moved faster now, pressing harder against paper. Cassius heard the changes in how people said his name. The same 3 syllables carried entirely different weights depending on who spoke them. Broadcasters stretched it into spectacle. Cassius Clay, letting each pod hang in the air like an announcement of something significant about to happen. Old trainers at other gyms clipped it short, spitting it out in 2 hard beats, a warning compressed into sound. Former champions, men whose fists had shaped entire eras and whose opinions carried the authority of scar tissue and surviving, mentioned him in interviews with careful distance. He talks too much. He hasn't earned this yet. Someone needs to teach him a lesson. The phrases appeared in print, black ink on white paper, statements that couldn't be taken back or softened later. They sat permanent in archives, in barbershop conversations, in the minds of everyone who read them and nodded in agreement. The air around boxing gyms changed when he walked in. Not everywhere, not with everyone, but enough that he felt it. That subtle recalibration of social temperature that happens when someone stops being welcomed and starts being tolerated. Sparring partners worked with him because they were paid to. Some still respected the talent. Others performed their duties with visible reluctance, fulfilling contracts without enthusiasm. He noticed who made eye contact, who didn't, who spoke to him directly and who spoke to Angelo instead. As if the trainer could serve as buffer between the fighter and the discomfort his presence created. The locker room before fights became its own kind of theater. He entered grinning, shoulders loose, voice carrying across tile and concrete. He bounced on his toes. He called out predictions, rounds, and methods of victory delivered with absolute certainty. No hesitation, no room for doubt to slip between the words. Flashbulbs erupted like small detonations. Microphones angled toward his mouth, held by hands attached to reporters who'd learned he always gave them something usable. He delivered exactly what they came for. Every word quotable, every claim large enough to scale into tomorrow's headline. Then the show ended. The cameras got packed away. The reporters filed out, notebooks full, deadlines approaching. Angelo Dundee stayed. The trainer watched him in those minutes after performance, when the mask didn't strictly need to be worn but somehow remained locked in place anyway. Dundee said little. He adjusted hand wraps with practiced efficiency. He checked Cassius's stance, made small corrections to weight distribution, ensured the body was prepared for what the mouth had promised. He never told Cassius to stop talking. He never told him to keep going. He simply stayed present while the weight of all those words, all those predictions and proclamations, settled into the shoulders and fists that would have to defend them. The trainer understood something crucial that he never spoke aloud. The talking wasn't separate from the fighting. It was part of the same machinery, the same survival mechanism, the same refusal to shrink that kept this kid from Louisville standing upright in rooms designed to make him bow. Each fight carried additional pressure now, layers of expectation stacked like weight plates on a bar. Winning wasn't enough. It had never been enough. Not really. But now the insufficiency became explicit. Winning easily wasn't enough. If he struggled even briefly, if an opponent landed clean, if a round went longer than predicted the next day. columns sharpened their conclusions with the precision of men who'd been waiting for permission to say what they already believed. See, the mouth writes checks, the fists can't cash. He's fast, but he's fragile. One real punch and the predictions stop. Let him face someone who won't be intimidated by words. Cassius read them all. He claimed he didn't. He laughed when people brought up negative press, waved it away as if attention of any kind served his purposes equally. But the pages found him anyway. Left on training room tables, corners folded to mark particularly cutting passages. Slipped inside his locker, quoted by people who thought they were helping by preparing him for criticism he'd already absorbed, memorized, and filed away in whatever part of his mind stored fuel for later burning. The crowd split visibly now, a division that became more pronounced with each fight. Some sections roared when he entered the ring, feeding on his certainty, starved for someone who refused to apologize for taking up space. Young men mostly, some women, people who saw in his refusal something they recognized or wished they could access themselves. Other sections booed with purpose, not playful gearing, not the theatrical antagonism that makes sporting events exciting. Genuine resentment, the sound of people who wanted him hurt, who wanted to see him knocked down hard enough that the grin finally disappeared, who needed him punished for the crime of being young and talented and absolutely unashamed of both. He stood between those opposing energies before every fight, target and champion simultaneously, loved and hated in equal measure by different halves of the same room. The rope bisected the crowd into factions that couldn't both be right. Either he was everything wrong with modern boxing or everything it needed. Either his confidence inspired or his arrogance demanded correction. There was no middle position. No one left his fights feeling neutral. Angelo understood what that position cost, even if Cassius never articulated it directly. After one fight in New York, standing in the corridor while his fighter held court with a fresh wave of reporters, the trainer leaned against cold concrete and simply watched. The kid never stopped moving, even standing still, answering questions. Some part of him stayed in motion, a foot tapping, shoulders shifting, head bobbing slightly. Defense against silence, against the possibility that if he paused too long, held still too completely, the weight of all that scrutiny would crush him flat against the ground. Dundee saw the machinery of it, how the constant motion, the endless talking, the predictions that kept coming even when they created more problems than they solved, how all of it served as armor, not the kind that protected from physical damage, the kind that protected from the alternative, from quietness, from invisibility, from becoming just another black fighter who learned to be grateful for whatever opportunities white promoters offered, who understood that survival meant knowing your place and keeping your voice low and your eyes down. That version of survival felt like death to Cassius, and Dundee understood, so he never asked for silence. He asked for precision instead. Channel it, use it. Make them so angry they can't think straight. Then take them apart. When the bell rings. The question arrived late at night in hotel rooms that all looked identical. Detroit, Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles. Different cities. Same furniture. Same curtains. Same industrial carpet that smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and the passage of countless temporary lives. Cassius lay awake while the city beyond his window either slept or didn't. Traffic sounds rising and falling in patterns that marked time without meaning. Shoot? Hissed up. Should he pull back the predictions? Soften the proclamations? Let his fists speak alone without his voice leading the way? The thought arrived quietly, moved through his mind without force, examined itself in the dark. It lasted seconds. Ten bunny set? Because pulling back meant admitting they were right. It meant agreeing that confidence required permission from people who would never grant it. It meant accepting that a young black fighter from Louisville had to earn the right to believe in himself loudly, publicly, without apology. And that transaction felt impossible. to complete. No amount of winning would satisfy the men already convinced he'd gone too far. Victory wouldn't change their minds. It would just force them to find new reasons for their disapproval. So the choice clarified itself in those dark hotel rooms. Not whether to continue. How much further to go? If they hated him for speaking, he'd give them more words. If they doubted him for predicting, he'd predict in greater detail, with more specificity, with more certainty. The ring would remain his courtroom. Every fight a trial, every victory insufficient evidence for a verdict already written before the opening bell rang. He didn't talk about loneliness, did unname the particular isolation that came from being watched constantly by thousands while being understood by almost no one. He trained harder instead, pushed rounds until his legs carried him on instinct alone, muscle memory replacing conscious thought, moved until exhaustion erased everything except the immediate physical demands of the present moment. Angelo watched this too, the way Cassius used his body to escape his mind, and said nothing. Some truths didn't need to be spoken aloud to be recognized. Some weights had to be carried in silence, at least for now, at least until the world was ready to understand what they actually meant. The world wanted a simple story, hero or villain, entertainer or threat, inspiration or warning. They wanted clean categories, clear boundaries, an easy answer to the question of what Cassius Clay represented and whether that representation deserved celebration or condemnation. What they received instead was something more difficult to categorize, more complicated to process. A young man who refused to fit cleanly into the boxes prepared for him, who wouldn't choose between being talented and being loud, between proving himself and promoting himself, between the humble gratitude they expected and the self-assured certainty he embodied instead. He stood at the intersection of admiration and contempt, impossible to ignore and impossible to forgive, exactly as he'd planned. Though the full cost of that position was only beginning to make itself known, the attention felt heavy in ways he hadn't anticipated. The division felt sharper, the isolation felt deeper. But backing down now would mean everything he'd already endured had been wasted. Would mean the men who wanted him silent had been right to want it. So he trained, he fought, he predicted, he won, and the world kept trying to decide what to do with him. When you demand to be seen, you can't control what people choose to see.